Show your T-Ball team spirit and buy your hard-working Art Lab team a cup of coffee, which helps fuel purchases of high-octane equipment and T-Ball tech that get poured back into percolating, highly caffeinated content for you. Just go to buymeacoffee.com and search TherapyBites.
On this episode of TherapyBites Art Lab.
Hey T-Ballers, welcome to another great episode of TherapyBites Art Lab, and are we going to embiggen your brains today? Former inner city sage, a genuine one, he's a real life Yoda, only taller and in our opinion, nicer dressed. He's not like those dime store a dozen pseudo sages you find on social media. He's on a mission, and that mission is to bring joy back into education in the workplace by transforming struggling and reluctant readers into more passionate and proficient readers. He's here to show us how to make reading a lifelong habit and to train you to be a Yoda-like sage yourself with Jedi skills to communicate your message through effective and inspirational storytelling. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, Dr. Danny's superpowers were developed during his experiences as an inner city school teacher, and that magical elixir, well, it's just as close as your local library or your bookstore inside the contents of the right books to help you along your own personal Jedi discovery journey. Here's Dr. Danny on an episode we call Brains and Bookworms, the psychology of success through reading.
Stay tuned following the interview for On the Couch and Off the Rocker, our special guest's psycho-silly analysis by Art Lab's own head cabbager, Dr. Ima Freudnot.
Welcome to TherapyBites Art Lab, where Dr. Heath and his special guests share real-life stories of helping and healing, fresh from the actual therapy couch, while taking a bite out of common counseling missteps and misconceptions. And now, here's Heath and the T-Ball team.
And welcome back, T-Ballers, to another episode of TherapyBites Art Lab. And for those of you new to the program, that stands for Accurate Realistic Thinking and Life-Affirming Beliefs, where we try to bring you every week really great world-class ideas on how to embiggen your thinking so that you can big-size your life. And it is our privilege today to have world-class educator Dr. Danny Brassell. And Danny, you know, you just told me how to say that, and I hope I got it right. I'm big on names since so many people mispronounce mine. I get called Heath and Keith and Steve and Thief and all kinds of things. So welcome to the show today, and we look forward to an enlightening discussion on brains and bookworms, the psychology of success through reading. And I want to start out, I've been wanting to do this ever since I knew we were going to have you on the show. I'd like to get your take on what one of my good friends said to me one time. And you might think this is fairly alarming. A good friend of mine and I were in the gym, and he said, well, what'd you do this weekend? And I said, I read whatever book I was reading at the time. And my friend literally looked at me and asked me this question. He said, you read? And I thought, is that a real question? Or are you trying to be funny? I said, well, of course I read. And he said, well, when do you read? Well, it'd be easier to tell you when I don't read because I'm always reading something. And I said, do you read? And he said, I don't read. And I said, what do you mean you don't read? You went to high school. He said, like I said, I don't read. I said, how did you get through school and you didn't read? He said, Heath, I'm telling you, I don't read. And what's your take on that? Do you find people that they literally simply do not read and have never read?
Absolutely, Dr. Heath. Thank you for that question. I feel bad for that guy. I wish he was one of my students. He'd be reading the literature story. And he's not atypical. Unfortunately, he's more of the norm, not the exception. I think schools are doing an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching kids how to read if they never want to read? I teach people why to read because I've never had to tell a kid go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid go read. I want them to do it because they enjoy it. And so it breaks my heart when I hear grown-ups that are talking that way. But you give him to me for a couple of months and he'll be a voracious reader, I promise.
That's awesome. I'm taking it that you actually show people the win-win in reading. I was a 7 Habits instructor, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People for years. I went around the country training in that. And Covey talks about you can look at a win-win situation, lose-win situation, win-lose situation, or lose-lose situation. Excuse me, there's my cough from my head cold there. But Covey talked about looking for win-win situations, and I think, based on my experience, people just don't see the benefit. You know, if you're going to do something, what return on investment do I get? Is that what you try to teach people? What's the return on investment about reading at all?
Well, it's definitely one of the things I show people, Dr. Heath, is, I know that there's plenty of readers out there that don't become successful leaders, but I have never, ever read about an effective, successful leader that was not also a voracious reader. And it doesn't matter whether it's in business. You have people like Elon Musk, who's the richest man in the world. He still reads at least 1 book a day, sometimes up to 3 books a day. Warren Buffett spends his entire day just reading in his office. If you look in the military, generals like General Patton was a voracious reader. General Schwarzkopf, they said, could read in 4 languages and could quote Shakespeare vociferously. You look in entertainment, all these actors and actresses, they have to read their scripts, and even people that are dyslexic, like Sylvester Stallone and Tom Cruise and Whoopi Goldberg, they are readers as well. You look in athletics, Bill Belichick, the football coach, 6-time Super Bowl champion, is said to have the largest library of football literature. LeBron James, before he played in the NBA Finals for the Miami Heat, I could have kissed him because they showed him in the locker room reading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I'm like, wow, you just did more to get kids excited about reading than I'll ever do. So it really doesn't matter what the field. There's a direct link between reading and success.
Wow. And as your work as a teacher, have you noticed a big difference in the mindset of your students, the ones who read more and the ones who just don't?
Well, I don't have any that don't, Sarah.
Well, that's wonderful. That really is.
Well, and it doesn't take that much. So when I was in middle school, I've taught all age levels I always say from preschoolers all the way up to rocket scientists. But when I was a middle school teacher, I was the only teacher in the school's history not to have a single student tardy. And the reason was I always started off my class by reading a Paul Harvey story. I'm an old guy. I grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio. He'd come on. I
love Paul Harvey.
He's just great. He'd come on every day at 12:15. He'd say, "I'm Paul Harvey," with the rest of the story. And he'd tell you this 5-minute story. The entire time you're trying to figure out who's he talking about or what's the company he's talking about. And my students just loved those. And actually, the last book that I wrote, Leadership Begins with Motivation, is basically an homage to Paul Harvey. The thing that I saw was the problem was a lot of Paul Harvey stories are about like the founders of Sears Roebuck. Well, kids today have no idea what Sears Roebuck is, and so I had to create an updated version. And so my book includes stories of entrepreneurs like Sarah Blakely and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Has a little bit more updated. And it's actually interesting, after I wrote the book, I noticed that most of my stories were of white male Americans. And so the book I'm writing right now is predominantly female, minorities, and international examples, because kids have to hear examples from all over the place. But Sarah, if you really want to get kids reading, you got to show them that excitement. And so I'm constantly talking about, well, what are you reading? And this is an important point I make to people. I want everybody to listen to this. The research is really clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People read better. And I always tell this to parents. The little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to be a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. Captain Underpants is actually the gateway drug to Shakespeare, but we got to get the kid hooked first. And
I
so
love
it goes
that.
Yeah, it goes back to your friend, Dr. Heath. Give him a couple of months with me. I'll get him pumped up because we're going to talk. And this is what you can be doing with him all the time is talking about, it doesn't have to just be books, by the way. Everybody thinks reading, they think you got to read Dostoevsky, War and Peace. I'm like, no, reading, I love to read short books. One of my fun things that I do is I have one of the top book clubs online. It's called lazyreaders.com. It's been online since 2003. And so basically every month I provide you 10 book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages. So you have something you can read when you're stuck in a boring meeting. And it's fun. I give a lot of students, I'll give them magazines to read, or I'll read aloud a newspaper article I find interesting. And then we have the whole thing that people are talking about nowadays is physical books versus ebooks. They always ask me, well, which one is better, Danny? And I'm like, well, they're both great. I like physical books because I'm an old guy. At this point, you chop off my head and you count the rings. I mean, but I like physical books. But my wife, she loves her little Kindle, and I'll make an argument on why the Kindle is wonderful. I mean, my wife is from Singapore, and so every other summer we fly back to Singapore to visit her family. And while I'm packing 20 books in my backpack, she only has to pack a 1-pound Kindle, which has access to the entire world's library. Another thing I like about the Kindle is I like reading in bed at night, and it drives my wife crazy because I always have my lamp on. She doesn't need a lamp because her Kindle illuminates itself. And then again, I'm getting old. It's tough for me to read the print a lot of the times. No problem on the Kindle. You can adjust the font size to make it bigger. And so there's all kinds of ways to get people excited about reading. The more excited you get people to read, the more likely they are to read. And the more you read, the better you get. So that's a very long answer to a short question, Sarah.
No, thank you.
It sounds like it's similar advice to what is the best diet or what is the best exercise regimen. And I tell people, the best diet and the best exercise regimen is the one that you will do and the one that you will continue doing. And with reading, find something that you love to do. I mean, my reading regimen is maybe kind of odd. I love all kinds of things. And for most of the year, I will read a combination of philosophy type works, many of which I've read over and over and over and over again just to refresh my memory, or neuroscience, psychology books. But then I'll intersperse murder mysteries. And at the holidays, especially Halloween, I'll spend a whole month reading the old spooky stories from Victorian England and, the Canterville ghost and things like that. I mean, I will switch it up. And I think that people have a great misunderstanding, and they automatically have a pre-formatted block, a pattern of thinking when you say reading. And I love teachers. I don't want to, come down on teachers here, but because I had some great ones. But do you think that has something to do with how kids are taught about reading in school? They just develop this whole block toward reading?
Wow, you just covered a lot of stuff. I feel like a Baptist in your front row going amen. I absolutely love it. So we'll address a whole bunch of things you said there. First off, I love that you're having a buffet of different types of reading materials. I always tell people, don't get stuck in one type of pattern. There's all kinds of wonderful things to read. I like that you were talking about reading mysteries and things like that. It's, I love reading presidential biographies, and so I'm always picking up things about different presidents. And I just read a biography on President Eisenhower. And President Eisenhower, even though he grew up poor in Kansas, he was a voracious reader, read all about the Greek wars and the Romans. He had a huge war knowledge, and so becoming the commander of the Allied forces, he understood all the different elements he had to deal with. President Clinton, they say, when he had to make tough decisions emotions and he was stressed out, he would just sit there and read like quick little murder mysteries would relax him. President Kennedy, a lot of people forget this. When President Kennedy, he was at a press conference once, and a reporter asked him what he was reading, and he said, "Oh, I'm reading this really cool book about this spy named James Bond." Because of that statement, Hollywood bought the rights to the James Bond books, and that's why they made the James Bond movie.
Oh my goodness.
So cool.
So I love that you said that. Now, addressing what you were talking about in schools, there's a lot of truth to what you say. I always point out to people, 96% of American kindergarten through second grade teachers are female. And I think that most of us teachers, we tend to read and show enthusiasm to our students, the types of books that we're interested in. And, little boys have very different tastes than little girls. There's a great Diary of a Wimpy Kid by Jeff Kinney. I don't remember which one it was, but the mother of Greg Heffley decides to have a mother-son book club. And so she invites all the boys from the neighborhood to bring books, and they'll read books together. And the mom, she's brought like Little House on the Prairie, Little Women, Sarah Plain and Tall. And the boys have brought like How to Cheat at Video Games, the Book of Bodily Functions, dinosaurs. And I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, Dr. Heath. That's where I see the disconnect. Is I was watching a teacher a couple of weeks ago, and she asked a first grade boy. She said, "Well, what's your favorite sport?" And he said, "Soccer." And she said, "Well, I like basketball, so I picked out a basketball book for us to read." And I thought, lady, the kid just told me he likes soccer.
Amazing.
Soccer book. It's kind of like, well, I got sound effects.
Yes. That's me when you're in an important meeting and you forget to mute your phone. And I have a busy phone, but that came through there. I want to give a shout out to Danny Brightwell. Was my high school English teacher. And I think that a lot of my love of reading came through Danny Brightwell, who eventually became superintendent of the school where I attended. And he just made literature fun. I mean, he took us through the different stories, and he just kind of made it fun. For all you youngins out there listening, there actually was a Google in my day when I was 7 years old, 6 or 7, and it was called the World Book Encyclopedia. That was Google. And this big, huge box arrived at my door, and it was just magical that I could get lost in those stories and all that information in the World Book Encyclopedia. And I would read those things from cover to cover. It had nice glossy color photos and things like that. And then, well, as you often hear in drug use, as you kind of alluded to earlier, talking about it being a gateway drug, for me, the World Book Encyclopedia was a gateway drug. And then early on in my relationship with my wife, I started sneaking off to bookstores and feeding my addiction for books. And then the worst thing possible happened. That for somebody like me, the worst thing possible happened. I heard about Amazon, and it almost got out of control because I was buying books and buying books and buying books. And my wife eventually said, "Look, this has got to stop. You've got enough books." And I thought, what's wrong with you? Is that even possible? How could you ever? I mean, it was like saying to a meth addict, "You've had enough meth." I mean, to me, how could you ever have enough books? And my library is wall-to-wall books. But I think the moral of the story for me was that I found value in it because there is escapism. I don't need a drug to escape real life. I can just hide out in a book. It has to have limits. It can take me to faraway places. And that's why I love my... There's a book that I think is right down the line of Stephen King called Yard Work. And it's a wonderful, spooky book. And the thing that books do for me, I find from a neurological perspective, and it may be while Bill Clinton was reading murder mysteries or whatever he reads in a tough moment, is different subject matters call on different resources of your brain. Your brain has to think in different ways based on the material that you're reading. You'll think much differently reading a book about soccer, like the young man loves soccer, but was given a basketball book for some odd reason, than if you're reading a murder mystery or a book about philosophy. I mean, your brain is really highly specialized in different areas, if not compartmentalized, and it listens in different ways to different things, and that's why I like the buffet. What's your habit of reading, Danny? What do you like?
Well, yeah, I feel like I'm at an AA meeting. My name is Danny B, and I am like you. And it's actually kind of ironic, to tell you the truth, because I grew up hating reading. My father is a librarian, and I always hated the public library. It always smelled funny. The furniture was always uncomfortable. There was always some elderly woman telling me to be quiet. The homeless guy by the bookshelves thought he was a vampire. I always hated the library. It wasn't until 7th grade I had that teacher that you're talking about. His name was Will Hobbs. Will Hobbs is now one of the best-selling young adult authors in the world, but he was my 7th grade English reading teacher in Durango, Colorado. And he was the person that got me reading for the first time. He had 5,000 books in his classroom library, and every day at the beginning of class, he would tell us what he was reading. We would tell him what we were reading, and the rest of the 50-minute period, we read.
Wow.
Whenever we finished a book, we'd go up to Mr. Hobbs. He'd put down the book he was reading. He'd ask us 3 or 4 questions, and if we got them right, he'd give us a point. Every book up to 200 pages was worth 1 point. Every extra 100 pages is worth another point. You needed 25 points to get an A, and the top 5 point totals had their names written on the board.
Oh.
I wanted my name on that
Yes.
board. So 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, 500-page book, 4-point book.
Oh.
Also, an excellent Disney film starring James Mason and Kirk Douglas.
Oh,
I
yeah.
didn't really feel like reading a 500-page book, so I took the book up to Mr. Hobbs. He asked me 4 questions, and I learned a valuable lesson that day. Books ain't always like the movies.
Oh,
That's right.
That's true.
That's what Mr. Hobbs did. He
Uh-oh.
gave me the points, and that's when I learned a great teaching trick. Guilt works, because I read every word of every book from that point forward. I wound up with 44 points, went well above and beyond what I had to do. He used the single greatest strategy I've ever seen a teacher use to get a kid excited about reading.
Mhm.
He found out what I was excited about, which was football. And so at least once a week, he'd come up to me with a football book. He's like, "Hey, Danny, check out this book on John Elway. I know you'll like it." What are the odds I open up that book? In my experience with kids of all ages, it's 100%. Kid might not read it, but they're going to open it. And also, by the 4th time I do that with a kid, I find they start trying to read that book, because there's nothing more powerful than somebody significant in your life, a teacher, a pastor, a coach, a parent, a buddy, saying, "You know what? I was thinking of you when I was reading this." So that's what I'm going to tell you again, Dr. Heath, with that buddy that doesn't read. Find something that you think he'd find interesting and say, "You know what? I was reading this, and I was thinking of you. I think you'd find this interesting." That's how you get them tricked into reading.
That's incredible
That's
advice.
wonderful.
And I would add on to that by saying what's going on is you're finding a way to make it a win for the person. And I think in schools often we don't do a good job teaching kids what return on investment do I get out of this. I'll have patients come to me and they will say, and I have a home office. I've had a home office my whole career, and I've done this for 38 years. And they'll say, "I want to live in a house like yours." And I'll say, "No, you don't." "Oh, yes, I do." "Well, no, you don't." "Well, why do you keep telling me I don't when I'm telling you that I do?" And I'll say, "Well, because you had a math assignment that you blew off, or a reading assignment that you blew off. Those are stepping stones to living in a better place than even I live. But don't tell me that you want to get from point A to point B and you don't want to take the steps in between." And reading is, well, as you so well put, one of the biggest things associated with success. I don't know I mean, that might be an interesting research topic. All of the non-readers who have been fabulous successes, but I think that it would be dwarfed by the number of readers who have been successes. Have you heard about this? Here's something I just learned recently, connecting the dots, is that Epictetus, an early philosopher who was also a slave and who was crippled, he gave a book from his library, wound up in the hands of another philosopher, and finally to a guy named Marcus. And Marcus took that book and made that, he built his life around the works of Epictetus, and Marcus's last name was Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king of the most powerful kingdom that has ever existed on earth, the Roman kingdom at one point. But here's Paul Harvey's the rest of the story, is you can see hints of Epictetus in Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, a voracious reader, and also the framer of our, one of the framers of our republic, gave some Epictean advice to his own son. Every situation has two handles, and you get to decide which handle to manage the situation with. And so therefore, without Epictetus, we would not have a Marcus Aurelius. And without a Marcus Aurelius, we wouldn't have a Thomas Jefferson. And without a Thomas Jefferson, we may not have a republic. And all that started with reading. All that started with a book. And that just blows me away that more people don't understand that.
I love it, Dr. Heath. This is how you get people excited. I mean, that's the buildup. I'll read you one. This is one of the little stories I put in the book that the kids like. On the morning of January 17th, 1977, Gary Gilmore, in a plain T-shirt, strapped into a chair with a bag over his head, awaited a firing squad of 5 law enforcement officers to execute him at the state prison in Draper, Utah. Convicted of murdering a gas station employee and motel manager in Utah the year before, Gilmore would be the first person in the United States to be executed in nearly a decade. Shortly before his execution, prison officials asked Gilmore if he had any last words. Neither he nor anyone else that day would know the impact of those words. Over 10 years later, in 1988, Dan Whedon, an advertising executive who co-founded the Whedon and Kennedy Agency in Portland, Oregon, made something of a morbid pitch to a struggling fashion company. He recalled the inmate's final words and used a slight variation for his pitch, and seemingly everyone hated his idea for the company's new slogan. "Just trust me on this one," Whedon implored the company's co-founder. And the co-founder, his company, and the public have not looked back since. The co-founder's name was Phil Knight. The struggling brand he co-founded was a shoe company called Nike. Wow. An advertising executive, Dan Whedon, slightly altered death row inmate Gary Gilmore's final words, "Let's do it," into the phrase, "Just do it."
Oh my word.
I love it. I love stories like that, Dr. So thank you for the Marcus Aurelius tip.
Holy moly.
I think something too that helps, I know as a child, something that helped me that really got me into reading, my gateway book drug was The Tale of Despero. And I think it was my 5th grade teacher that
wonderful,
so good. I still love it. I'll still read it. It's wonderful. But if you haven't read it, please read it. It's great. It's about a mouse and rats, and it's a lot better than I just made it sound. But
because who doesn't love mice and rats?
I love them. They're so cute.
Well, Sarah, I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a movie company called Walden Media, and Walden Media, they did something which was extraordinary. They polled 10,000 school librarians across the United States. First of all, that's extraordinary that we still have 10,000 school librarians. I wish we had a lot more. But second of all, they polled all these librarians and they said, well, if you could make any of your favorite books into a movie, what would be the books you would make? And so the number one choice was the Chronicles of Narnia. So they produced the Chronicles of Narnia. I believe number 2 was The Tale of Despero.
So good.
I think number 3 was Bridge over Terabithia. 4 was Holes. And I think they're filming number 5 was the Berenstain Bears, which from what I understand, they're doing a live action Berenstain Bears where they're in Los Angeles, which kind of cracks me up. I think that they're going to play comedy with that because I'm like, Mother Bear, are you down with the homies in the hood?
Are you down with the homies? I have a confession to make hearing Sarah talk about the Tale of Despero, because I don't want people to think that you've got to start out even like Sarah did with Tale of Despero, or how I started out with my Google of the day, the World Book Encyclopedia, because it was shortly after the World Book Encyclopedia made it to my door that I discovered this other just amazing piece of world-class literature by who I think is one of the world's foremost authors, and just a simple guy whose last name was Lieberman. The most famous author or one of my favorite authors, his last name was Lieberman. Now, you might not know who that is, but I would read his I guess it was monthly installments. He would write an editor's page at the end of this wonderful work of artistic fiction, and his tagline was "Nuff said," apostrophe Nuffscid. He would answer letters from readers just like me, the 7-year-old me, and it was before he became popular. I mean, he was popular in the little nerdy crowd I was popular in, but I still have file cabinets full of this world-class literature, better known to people these days as The Amazing Spider-Man.
Wow.
And the author's name was Stan Lee, who then became Stanley Lieberman. And so the World Book Encyclopedia was great, but all the wisdom with great power must also come great responsibility is straight from Stan Lee, who, I don't know this because he's unfortunately passed away. It was a dark day for the world when that happened. But he was such a meek, mild-mannered person and so non-pretentious. But I think he got that from the world of philosophy. I mean, that is straight out of Stoic philosophy. With great power must also come great responsibility. Would it be great if a lot of our world politicians would learn that? Maybe they should read Spider-Man. But
I think politicians need to read a lot of children's books because
Yeah.
they really do. Most of the important stuff is in the children's books, like be kind to one another, don't call other names. I mean, I don't see how. That's why I don't follow politics. I'm like, if you call a person a jerk, how do you expect them ever to work with you? I mean, this is kindness 101. I thought you were going to go, Dr. Heath. So one of my favorite book, the book that I always give to boys, if I find a kid, so Sarah, if you have a kid that doesn't like to read, this is the go-to book for me. So Hugh Weaver, back in the 1950s, was in he was in a hunting lodge with some friends in Ireland, and he got in a debate with them on what the fastest game bird was in Europe, and nobody could figure it out because they didn't have the encyclopedia with them or whatever. And so Hugh Weaver, he's like, you know what? I'm gonna start writing all these things down. And so he put them all into a book, and he started giving them to different pubs because he wanted to settle all these bar fights on know-it-alls. And so he'd give them all to the pubs because he worked for this beer company. And so he named the book after his beer company. He called it the Guinness Book of World Records.
Oh, yes, of course.
I remember getting that out of the school library and just being amazed.
Oh, yeah.
For full show notes and transcript of today's episode, go to therapybites.podbean.com.
The Therapy Bites podcast is HIPAA compliant. No identifying patient information will be disclosed by Therapy Bites podcast hosts or Therapy Bites podcast guests without permission from patients or guardians. All personal stories are de-identified in order to comply with HIPAA, the NASW Code of Ethics, and the ethical principles of psychologists and Code of Conduct. Fresh from the therapy couch and from the deep dark recesses, stories may involve exploding preconceived notions and topics uncomfortable to underthinkers and small farm animals. Audience discretion and duct taping your head for safety is advised. Concrete-headed Kool-Aid drinking humans assume all risks associated with any possibility of choking to death on the accurate, realistic thoughts presented in the Art Lab. This is natural selection, and TherapyBites podcast management and hosts are not responsible.
My son and I watched the latest Thor movie, Love and Thunder, and throughout they had Guns N' Roses music, and goodness, that is a really long time ago that some of that Guns N' Roses music came out. But that got me thinking about Axl Rose and where he came from and what was his developmental history, and he has a very sordid one, sadly to say. But a quote I'd like to share with you is him talking about his clinical experience in attempting to get help. And I want to emphasize the word attempting to get help. He says, I went to a clinic thinking it would help my moods. The only thing I did was take one 500 question test, filling in the little black dots. All of a sudden I'm diagnosed with manic depressive. Let's put Axl on medication. Well, the medication doesn't help me, Axl says. It doesn't help me deal with stress. The only thing it does is help keep people off my back because they figure I'm on medication. Folks, that is not how therapy is supposed to go. There's supposed to be a full assessment. It should never be a medication-only approach. There is no salvation at the bottom of an amber-colored pill bottle. And psychiatrists should know that, clinicians should know that, physicians should know that, but doctors and clinicians, counselors, therapists, whatever you might want to call them, often get lazy and go for the quick fix. Don't let them get away with that. There's cutting-edge research-proven strategies that have been around for a long, long time. They take more time, they take more effort, they take more clinical experience and clinical focus, but you deserve it. Your Freshman to Therapy Couch tip today is buckle in for the long-term run and do that change top down with changing your thinking, not bottom up with some type of chemical. Doc Heath, fresh from the Therapy Couch. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
You're listening to Therapy Bites Art Lab, bite-sized therapy for your brain with Dr. Heath and the T-Ball team. The best advice on the net. No copay required.
Welcome to the TherapyBites Art Lab Library, where we have poured over thousands of volumes to bring you the latest Couch Crumbs quote. Oh, would you like a napkin? You're getting crumbs in the book.
That okay. Me eat book.
Oh. And now today's Couch Crumbs quote.
Oh, hello. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad you're here for our Couch Crumb quote of the day. Thoughts are like mold spores in the mind. They can be examined under the microscope of your metacognition. A quote by Doc Heath.
Oh, you got crumbs on the couch. Extra points for you.
Live the art life. Become a T-Ball teammate Inner Circle supporter on Patreon at patreon.com/therapybites.
Here's Heath and the T-Ball team.
That's all. That's one of my favorite books of all time. As a kid, I would hide out in the library of my school. Danny Brightwell was the librarian at the time, Mr. Brightwell. Lots of fond memories there. But I would read the Guinness Book of World Records. What a great book! But for me, I guess there was a payoff, and that's one thing that I find kids and parents struggling with. Parents, it seems like we want to make reading boring for some reason. Go to your room and read your book. I mean, we send kids, you shouldn't, by the way, parents, don't do this. Don't use a kid's room as discipline. That is not discipline. Go to your room. You're grounded. Go to your room. And then we'll say, go to your room to do your homework, go to your room and read. I mean, that's just bad association. We have to create a return on investment. And that's what I see lacking in the world when it comes to reading, is people aren't clear what their return on investment with. Here's a confession I've never made on air, but I'll make it now. I was an intentional underachiever in school. I loved to read, but I didn't love to study and try to get the 4.0. My kind of subconscious goal was to put in as little work as possible and to just graduate. Because in my mind, why would you put in a lot of work to get a 4.0 if you're not getting anything from it? And so parents and kids alike, listen to what I'm about to say. Dr. Heath graduated with a 2.7, and I was so disappointed because my brain did the calculation. Look at all that wasted time to get that extra 0.7 when I could have studied less and just got the 2.0. I mean, I wasted all kinds of time getting that 0.7. I could have just had the 2.0. Well, what was the reason for that? The reason for that was I didn't see any possibility of what putting my head into my work would really do. But when I got to college, well, it was almost a 4.0. Why? Well, because I found meaning and purpose in it. I think parents, if you're going to expect your kids to read, number one, you have to be a reader. What sense does it make to tell your kids you need to read if a parent's not a reader? And also make it fun and make it a win-win. And Dr. Danny, how can parents do that? How can they make it? We've already talked about a lot of great things, but what are some ways that parents can make it a win-win for children?
That's great, Dr. Heath. I mean, you're giving all kinds of great ideas. Your kids must be better than mine. My 3 kids, the punishment is I'm like, get out of your rooms. You have to come to the living room. They're all sitting on their devices in their rooms all the time. And so that's a quick tip. So this is a big thing when you were asking me, what do I read? So I actually have books that I read with all of my kids and my wife. And so my oldest daughter, she's into this I think it's called Shadows and Fog series, this fantasy series. And so we've been reading those stories together. My son, he's into the Civil War. So we're reading The Killer Angels by Michael Schirra, which is one of the best books ever written. Everybody should read that book. Actually, that book was so well written. I read an interview with Laura Hillenbrand, who wrote Seabiscuit. And she said after she read The Killer Angels, she knew how she could make history interesting with Seabiscuit. And,
oh, wow.
Wonderful.
What is Killer Angels about?
So The Killer Angels is about the Battle of Gettysburg. And I'm telling you, Dr. Heath, if I had been given this book in high school, I would have been a history major. I've read so many history books because of this book. So have you ever heard of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain by chance?
I have not.
So you're an educated person. I'm an educated person. I've never heard of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was a professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, and he decided it was his duty to enlist in the Union Army, and so he was put second in command. Well, right before the Battle of Gettysburg, his commanding officer was promoted, and so he's put in charge of his platoon, and the first order he was given was there was 130 Irish deserters, and he was given the order to execute them. Well, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, he gives this speech to these guys straight out of King Henry V, the St. Crispian Day speech. He's like, they want me to kill you. I ain't killing anybody. He's like, but I'm telling you right now, I think this is the battle that wins the war. Now, I want to be able to tell my grandkids I was here. I mean, all these guys are pumped. And so out of 130 of them, 124 decide to fight with him. And so he's got about 300 guys all together, and he's on this little hill, and his job is to hold the flank. Now, I don't know a lot about the military. My brother's the big Air Force guy. He knows all military strategy. But basically, the flank is the Southern Army's approaching, and if the flank goes down, it exposes the rest of the Northern Army. So he's got 300 men. He's got like 9,000 guys charging at him. And so his guys are fighting ferociously. They're down to their last shot, and they look at Chamberlain. They're like, "What's the order, sir?" And he takes out his sword. He's like, "Bayonets!" And all these guys are pumped, and so they put on the bayonets. He's like, "Charge!" And 300 guys charge down this hill, and 9,000 Southerners surrender. This is actually a true story in the Battle of Gettysburg.
Oh my!
So he's shot in the foot, and the great thing about this book is every chapter is written from a different person's point of view. I mean, Abraham Lincoln's only mentioned once. They talk about slavery a little bit, but it's really, I mean, you listen to like General Longstreet and General Lee, you're like, man, the Southerners, they were so much better. They had such a better strategy than the North. The North was screwing it up. And And so the next chapter after Chamberlain's guys have won, he's been shot. And the next chapter is Hancock, who's the general for the Union. He's like, who's this guy Chamberlain? I got to meet him. And so he meets Chamberlain, and Chamberlain's like, oh, ready for duty, sir. Ready for the next battle. And Hancock's like, no. You just did your part, man. This is going to be a long war. They're going to probably attack from the front or from the back. So you and your men, you just relax here in the middle. So the next chapter is General Longstreet talking to General Lee, who's the commander at the South. And Longstreet's like, what's the order, General? And Lee's like, I bet you Hancock thinks we're going to attack from the front or the back. Let's surprise him and go for the middle, where Chamberlain is and his 300.
Oh, my goodness.
13,000 guys attack them. He wins again.
Oh, my.
This is a true story. This guy's.
Wow.
So then the end of the book, it gives you like a little paragraph on what happened to every single person. And so Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who you and I have never even heard about, and we have been educated, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, he wound up to fight in 7 more battles. He got wounded in every single battle. He impressed General Grant so much that he asked Chamberlain to accept the Southern surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And Chamberlain, classiest act ever, he ordered the Northern troops to salute their Southern brothers when they surrendered. Total mess. I mean, where's that nowadays? So then he goes back to Maine. He becomes the president of Bowdoin College. He's elected governor 4 times. He never gets less than 80% of the vote. The guy should be on currency, and you and I have never even heard about him. So I'm sorry, I get really that book. I've given that book, all of them are like, oh, this is one of the best books I've ever read. So Michael Schirra, he won the Pulitzer Prize. He passed away, and then his son Jeff Schirra wrote a prequel and a sequel. They're not as well written, but they're still pretty cool. I mean, the prequel, Gods and Generals, I think, is the sequel.
Oh yes, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and then they were made into movies. The Killer Angels was made into the movie Getty.
My husband and I just watched that recently, actually.
So Jeff Daniels plays Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the movie. It's just unbelievable. So that's what I'm reading with my son. My youngest daughter, for some reason, likes literature, and so we just finished The Great Gatsby, which I can't stand The Great Gatsby, but after reading it with her, at least I appreciate the writing. I still hate the story.
Oh yeah.
And now we're reading Oliver Twist, which is Charles Dickens isn't the easiest person to. Everybody knows A Christmas Carol and everything. I'm like, read Oliver Twist. It's not the easiest thing to read, but it's well written. And then my wife, she loves Diana Gabaldon and the Outlander series together. And so, I mean, this is how families. You had mentioned it. You know, I have a feeling that television is here to stay, and I don't believe in blocking technology. I believe in embracing technology and working it in your favor. And so, a tip for all parents out there. President Bush Sr. over 30 years ago signed a very important law in this country. It says every television set in America has to have closed captioning. So turn on the closed captioning on your TV. And parents will say, well, wait a second, if the show's in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? I'm like, well, that's a fair point. Let me make a point, though. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the captioning? It's very difficult to do. You're on the planet, except for one. The country with the highest reading scores in the world watches the most TV in the world. It's Finland. And people always ask, well, how can this be? I'm like, well, because Finland makes really bad TV shows. And so what they have to do is they import all these old American sitcoms like Hogan's Heroes and Happy Days, Gilligan's Island, and they have to put subtitles for all of them. So if you want a quick way to get your kid reading with your kids, just put on the subtitles on the TV all the time. So again, it's a very long answer to a very short question.
Well, no, I love that. That's an amazing answer. I just want to point out a little bit of psychology about relationships. It is very dangerous to let your children have their own life on the internet, and you don't know what they're looking at, you don't know what they're reading. Or a kid like me reading comic books, and you don't know what they're reading. And, you know, Spider-Man, that's pretty safe. I mean, at least it was when Stan Lee was in charge. I don't know now. I don't read them recently. But if your kid's reading something, the best thing you can do as a parent is read the same books your kids are reading. My house burned down when I was in college, and I went to live with my wife's grandmother and grandfather. And I would come in every afternoon with the books that I left home at that time at my wife's grandparents' house. And her grandmother, Desi, was reading my psychology books. This little grandmother who, by the way, believed that the moon landing was a hoax. She never believed that men landed on the moon. It was on some set in Texas, and we're all being fooled. But she would read my psychology books so that she could do what? So that she could have a conversation with me about what I'm reading. The number one thing you can do as a parent to improve your relationship with your kids is read the same material, watch the same material. And if you're offended by it, well, then maybe they shouldn't be reading or watching it either. But be in sync with what they are feeding their brain, because that is what's going to determine who they are. Improve your relationships with people by reading the same material. And I think that's fabulous, Dr. Danny, that you guys do that. That's one of the most wonderful tips that I've ever heard is get on board and read the same thing as your family members.
Well, and I agree with you, Dr. Heath, that you made a very important point, is you need to, I don't believe in censoring books from kids, but I also don't promote certain books to kids. If I have a problem with it, actually, I just did the December edition for lazy readers this month, and this is kind of depressing to me. Whenever I'm looking for the young adult book recommendations, it is so difficult to find a young adult book that's not based on dystopian society or date rape or bullying. And I'm like, no wonder teenagers are screwed up, right? Something positive for them. So I always tell that to kids, you are what you read, so read good stuff. One of my mentors, Charlie Tremendous Jones, used to say, you're the same today as you will be in 5 years, except for two things: the people you meet and the books you read. So make sure you surround yourself with people that lift you up, and make sure you feed your mind with books that are positive.
Oh, that's fabulous. And on the censorship issue, that's big in our area, because there's lots of debates on what should be in the library and what should not be in the library. And I talk to patients a lot about underthinking. In my years, I've never ever run into a patient that I thought was overthinking. They thought about something too much. It's actually the reverse. They ignore important aspects of the situation, and that is underthinking. Well, let's put a different spin on books. Let's look at books like automobiles. And let's say that we have a library of these transportation vehicles. You have a little, motorized Jeep. You have a go-kart, you have a four-wheeler, you have a diesel truck, you have a fighter jet, and they're all in this library. Now, which one do you want to let your kid in?
Yeah.
Well, the kid's going to want to get the fighter jet. Well, that's great, but maybe they're not ready for the fighter jet. Who should be in charge of that? The parent should be in charge of that. And parents, I encourage you, it's not censorship anymore with books than it is censorship with transportation vehicles. Your kid may not be ready for an 18-wheeler, but maybe they can drive a go-kart. But no matter what they drive, why don't you take the drive with them? Don't just put it on autopilot in the hands of a kid. Take that drive with them.
Couldn't agree more, Dr. Heath. Amen. I love it.
Now, I want to draw a quick parallel and maybe burst a few bubbles here, because I just love the Killer Angels book that you talked about. I haven't read it, but I probably will now. And TV is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's now on our smartphones and tablets and all that kind of thing. And one of the biggest things is reality TV. And even my wife watches the Housewives of whatever, goofy city. They're all over. But let me burst some bubbles there. And forgive me for this. Hopefully nobody will sue me. But there is no such thing as reality TV. Every time you turn the camera on somebody, they become different. What you're not getting is reality TV. You're getting something that is possibly quite scripted. It's planned out. Even the disagreements and the arguments and the fights are planned out. It's not reality TV. There's a psychological effect called the Hawthorne effect. You can look it up. People change on camera. No such thing as reality TV. If you want real reality TV, read a book like Killer Angels. That's reality TV for the mind, because there was no censoring what happened, no scripting what happened. All that stuff happened right then, impromptu, in real time. So reality TV is at your local library or on your local Kindle, not between the Real Housewives of, Humperdinck, whatever it is, USA.
That's great, Dr. Heath. And I mean, that's one of the things I started off my career as a high school history teacher. And the first thing I always teach students when I teach history is history books are usually written by the winners. Every event in history has multiple points of view. And in this class, my job is to teach you how to think, not what to think. And that's kind of the problem with political discourse in this country, is people will listen to this TV network or this political party. And I'm like, but they're giving you a point of view. It's your job to actually do a little bit more research. I mean, I'm a Christian, and my pastor criticizes a lot of these mega pastors that preach this gospel of hope. And I always point out to my pastor, I'm like, well, I understand why you have a problem with that, but just so you know, that pastor is the person that got me interested in the word. It's now my job as a Christian to read the good book and to start interpreting it for myself and not letting others interpret it for me. So I think it's very wise for people to make, I mean, this is why you need to read, folks. You need to read different things. Same thing. There's no such thing as fake news. I tell people, there's only people that rely on one news source. It's exactly what you're saying with reality TV. It's a waste of your time when you have all these books and journals and magazines and newspapers at your disposal. Start reading.
Absolutely, and on my camera, for you, those of you that are watching on our YouTube channel, this little guy right here is my little Soren Kierkegaard finger puppet. Hi, Soren. Hi, I'm Soren Kierkegaard. And I'm dead now, but I wrote lots of good stuff. Soren come up with a concept, and he called it, he spoke about responsibility, and he talked about it as the ability to respond. He said there is a space between stimulus and response. And in that space is where we live our lives. We have the ability to respond. By the way, Viktor Frankl, a great existentialist philosopher, psychiatrist, talked about that a lot too. But yes, even as a person of faith, don't go and just, without a filter, suck up and drink the Kool-Aid that every talking head is saying. Even Scripture itself, especially in the New Testament, talks about one thing predominantly above all else, and that is your ability to respond, your ability to think. I mean, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, logos, meaning knowledge. And it's all about that. It's all about thinking. And one of the best things parents can do is not teach kids what to think, but to teach them how to think. As a parent, your job is to provide a very well-structured playground where your kids can experiment with their thinking. So here's a quick parenting tip. Instead of just disagreeing with what your kids say and saying, oh, that's stupid. Oh, you can't think that. Well, why can't they think that? Is there a law against thinking in our country? That's a very scary thing to me. Better question is, why are you thinking that? Or how did you decide that? Or what led you to think that? Could you think something else? What about this way of thinking or that way of thinking? The better thing is to come up with better questions. And you can do that only if you understand where they get those thoughts from. And that's what they read, what they see on TV, what they hear from their friends, what they see on the internet. And what are some great books that you might know of, Dr. Danny, about just becoming a more powerful thinker? Are there any books that you know that really key into that?
Well, I mean, obviously the Bible's going to get you thinking. I mean, I'm kind of a relatively new Christian. And so actually, one of the tips I always give people is this thing that everybody has in their pocket. Most people waste their time on it on social media and that kind of nonsense. When used properly, this is an amazing tool. So what I do is I set myself daily reminders every single day. And so I'm trying to learn different pieces of scripture. So like every day at 8:18 a.m., I get an alert and it reminds me Deuteronomy 8:18 is remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you the power to be successful in order to fulfill the covenant he confirmed to your ancestors with an oath. Hey, I remember it. Okay, once I
good job.
I try and learn other things. And so like I was sharing on our sound check, I'm a big fan of King Henry V. And so his most famous speech is in Act 4, Scene 4. So at 4:04 every single day, I practice the Henry V St. Crispian Day speech. What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin, if we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I got married on December 20th, and so every day at 12:20, I have an alert on my phone to tell my wife I love her. So these are the things that you can do. Oh, there you go. But you can use these tools in a positive way. Too much of us, they say garbage in, garbage out. I'm like, that's not true. Garbage in, garbage stays. People need to stop.
Oh, good point.
Mm-hmm.
I watched a horrible show on television the other night. It was called The News, and it totally depressed me. Stop. Here, turn off the TV news and read a funny children's book. I can already tell you what's on the news tonight. The world is coming to an end, and whoever the president is doing a bad job. It's news for the last 100 years. I'm like, read a funny children's book. You'll impress your friends. You'll say, yeah, I read a book cover to cover last night. Really? What was it about? It's about this little red hen, Start reading, man.
Oh, so cool,
Yes.
so cool. And you know what? I've used that term for years. I was going to be a systems analyst for computers in the mid '80s, and I decided that wasn't my gig. But that's one of the terms that stuck with me was GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. But you're actually right. I mean, try to forget something. I mean, try to on purpose think of a chunk of knowledge and try to forget it. Just forget about it. Put it out of your mind. Don't think about it. I mean, can you imagine a pink elephant with a little tutu? Well, sure you can. Now stop it. Well, garbage in, garbage stays. I think that's wonderful, Dr. Danny, and most people don't understand that. So even though I could watch anything on TV I want, I could watch anything. There is no censor on my TV set. Since my son is now grown, I took off the parental controls because I'm the parent. And I can watch anything. But get this, guys. I do not let myself watch anything. I do not let myself read anything because of the very thing Dr. Danny said. And that is, you can't freaking get it out of your head. Why would you put garbage in your head when it's not going to do you any good? So when you go to read a book, ask yourself, how does reading this book further my life? And if you ask me that about a scary story I read, I could tell you. I could say, well, it helps me enjoy the season of Halloween. It's kind of a thing that I don't got to focus on. It entertains me. It lightens my mood. Not burst balloons out there. Do you believe in ghosts? That's another episode, but only at Halloween. I only believe in ghosts at Halloween. And I let myself suspend my disbelief, and suspending disbelief is a healthy thing to do. Otherwise, you could never enjoy a movie. Thank you, Dr. Jay Summers at Lyon College, my speech and theater professor, for that. But ask yourself, how is reading this book going to move my life forward? And it's garbage, then just pick a different book. Books are like fertilizer for the mind. What is it that you're fertilizing?
That is such an important point, Dr. Heath. I mean, this is what I don't know why Americans are taught to finish what they start. If you don't like a book after the first chapter, put it down. Get another book. There's plenty of books out there. I mean, it's like eating a piece of food. You're like, oh, this is disgusting. It's better. No, it's still disgusting.
Yes.
If you don't like the first chapter, you're not going to like the second chapter. Put it down. I mean, here, I'll do something for all the people out there. I can do this because I'm a PhD. For all of you who have that thick book on your bedside table that you started 4 years ago, I absolve you of that book.
And Danny's doing the whole hand waving thing as if he's the Pope. By the way, no offense to anybody, but you only can see that on the YouTube channel.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry, I forget where I'm in the media.
But it's fabulous. Yeah, you are hereby absolved. Go ye and sin no more.
And I mean,
read something that lifts you up. I'm sorry, Sarah, I cut you off.
Oh, you're okay. It's okay. I was thinking the biggest book I've ever read, and I really enjoyed it, but there were certain chapters in it. I read Les Miserables.
Yeah.
And there's like a chapter in there that's like 60 pages describing France's sewer system. And I was just like, as a teenager, I was like, I have to read this chapter so I can have the street cred of I read Les Mis, which nobody else would have thought was cool except me. And you know, even if there's a chapter in a book, just skip that. You don't need to know the whole sewer system of France. Skip the chapter, get back to the story.
Well, we talked about the scripture. You know, if reading the book of Numbers is slowing you down, skip the book of Numbers.
Well, that's great, Dr. Heath, because I had read The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren, and I remember it was page 34. He said, if you have never read the Bible, read it for 10 minutes a day. It'll take you a year. So it only took me 10 months. But it was a struggle at first. And my wife, who's been a Christian her entire life, she said, oh, it's because you started with the Old Testament and you're reading in the King James Version. She's like, here's the New International Version. Start with the New Testament. And that was great because there's like little headings. I'm like, oh, here's where David and Goliath is in 1 Samuel and stuff like that. So that was very powerful to me. And I love, the person that really got me interested in reading more than anybody was when I was in college. I did a semester abroad in Spain. And if you've ever been in a country where everybody's speaking a different language, you get headaches, you have nightmares, you start to feel self-conscious. And I was getting so annoyed reading in Spanish. I went to a bookstore for the first time in my life, and I bought a beat-up copy of The Pelican Brief by John Grisham.
Oh. And
I read it in a night. And then I read The Firm in like a night. And I read A Time to Kill. And the thing I love about John Grisham, and Sarah, you'll appreciate this, is his books are all the same. Like all of them are like, the chapters are all like 6 pages long because it's like 10 o'clock at night. You're in bed and you finish the chapter and it says, and then he found the gun. And you're like, well, the next chapter is short, so I'll just read the next chapter. Well, the next chapter has something, it's about something totally different. But then you read that chapter and you're like, wait a sec, what's this? And then all of a sudden you read, and pretty soon it's 2 a.m. and you finish and I'm just like you, Sarah, maybe not Victor Hugo, but I'll read like these presidential, like I just read this presidential biography, Ike, by Michael Korda, 800-page biography on President Eisenhower. And it's like, chapter 1, page 1. Chapter 2, page 138. I'm like, oh!
Yes. It's like mercy.
Well, speaking of versions, by the way, readers out there are often, especially famous books, more than one version. Let's just take Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. You can find that in an updated version. Epictetus, you can find that in the updated version. Probably the most popular, of course, would be the Bible. One of my favorite bumper stickers is, if the King James Version was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Well, okay.
It's not a problem.
I'm sure Jesus could read in English.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But, the God's Word version, I mean, there's so many versions. The translations, find one. Mine was at Lyon College, the Harvard of the South, was the NIV, New International Version. But there's the New King James Version, and you can get apps on your phone that have 30 different versions. Don't just give up because one version doesn't speak to you.
Right. There's even comic book versions.
Oh, wow. That's a new one for me.
Yeah.
That's what you're right, Sarah, because I used to read to my kids in bed. I'd read them. The reason I started impressing my wife is I'd read the Robert Schuller Illustrated Bible, and there was pictures with all the scripture. And I'm a visual person, and so now I remember a lot of the scripture based on the Robert Schuller Illustrated Bible for kids, because I'm like, this. So that's how I remembered David and Goliath was 1 Samuel, because I'm like, there's the picture of David and Goliath.
And I want to point out one more thing about this. Do I have to be a Stoic philosopher to find value in the writings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus? Of course not. Do I have to be an atheist to find value in the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre? No. Or Albert Camus? No, of course not. But even though I'm a believer, I still read those things. Now, to that point, do I have to be a believer or a Christian to get value out of reading the Bible? No. You have my permission, and I could get Dr. Danny to give you the hand-waving, go forth, and you are absolved. Even if you're an atheist, you can find value in reading the Scripture. I don't have to be Buddhist to read some Buddhist works, and I do. And so just realize that there's value to be found in books of all kinds, sorts, and philosophies.
I love that, Dr. Heath, because so one of my positions, I'm a visiting distinguished professor at the American University in Cairo. Say that 5 times fast. When I'm in Cairo, I like to go to schools in the surrounding area. And so I went to my first Islamic school. And so I did a parent training at 2 p.m. 400 parents showed up. I couldn't believe it. And it was like the Muslim Brotherhood. All the guys had the long beards, and all the women were wearing, what do you call it? Where they cover their face.
Habib.
Hijab.
Hijab, okay.
Hijab. And we were talking like we're all talking right now, and I thought, shame on me. I had all these preconceptions about Muslims, and so I started my speech. I said, so I was reading this book the other day. Have any of you ever read the Quran? And they all laughed. And I'm like, oh, well, then you know the story. When the angel Gabriel appears to Muhammad in the cave, what's his first instruction to Muhammad? Because the first pillar of Islam is to read. And so I told all the parents, I said, so not only should we get your kids reading, it's actually written in your most sacred text. It's your duty to read. And I had 400 people nodding their heads. And I'm like, holy cow, who would have thought the Christian dude, his best audiences are Muslim audiences? Because now I see Islamic schools all over the place. But that's why you should read. It gives you a little bit, a better understanding. I like to get in other people's shoes. When there's a problem in society, I'm like, well, I want to try and understand this person's point of view. I might not agree with it. And I always tell this to people. You don't have to agree with a point of view, but it is really important in the thought process. I mean, you're a philosopher. Let's consider these different points of view. I mean, you were mentioning one of my favorite books of all time is Camus' The Stranger. It's one of the best ever to a book. It says, mother died today, or maybe it was yesterday. I mean, opening to a book. I was hooked from the opening line, and so that's why you should read. Is God gave you a brain. When people argue with me, they're like, "Man, you're disgraceful to God that you're questioning God." I'm like, you know what? I think God can take it. I think God gave you a brain.
Well, and there's lots of good examples in the Scripture. One of which is Job. Job was quite questioning of God, and I like to ask Christians a trick question, and I may not spill the beans on this episode, but what was the main thing the book of Job was about? If you say patience, you need to go back and read the book of Job. It was not about patience, about something greater than that. And one thing I would say about different cultures is before you criticize another culture, you need to at least do yourself the courtesy of reading 1 or 2 of the main books on which that culture rests, and then come back and criticize the culture. But we spend so much time criticizing cultures and belief systems, and we don't know the first thing about their belief system.
Well, I've gotten pretty old, and the older I get, the more I realize I don't really know anything. There's that great saying that when you're 18, you care what everybody thinks about you. When you're 40, you don't care what anybody thinks about you. And when you're 60, you realize nobody was thinking about you.
Oh, I love it. Yes. And I can't remember who said that, but that is fantastic.
Yeah. And then when you were talking about reading bumper stickers, so that's reading, folks. I tell people this. I'm like, reading is different things. I read a great bumper sticker the other day. It said, conservative in the morning, liberal in the evening. I thought, there you go. That's what people have to start thinking.
How cool. How cool. Well, Brains and Bookworms, the psychology of success through reading. One of the best things you can do if you want to succeed at your relationships, read a book. If you want to succeed at parenting, read a book. If you want to succeed at your occupation, read books. If you want to make $1 million, read books. If you want to be the best in your field, keep reading. And that's one of the things that was drilled into my head early on in my profession is there's no such thing as graduating. That is a ceremony. You never, ever graduate from learning. We're to be lifelong learners. And I am. I mean, really, my occupation is reading. I just do my job so I can pay for my reading habit.
I love it, Dr. Heath. Oh, as a thank you for having me on, I wanted to give you and all of your audience just a couple of freebies. If you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm going to give you two things. First of all, I'll give you a copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed. It's a book I wrote for a school principal who was trying to keep his faculty and staff positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, I give you an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's book recommendation that demonstrates the same concept. You can read that in 5 minutes. And then I'm also going to give everybody access to a 5-day reading challenge I did online last summer for about 700 parents, where every day for an hour, I'll give you all kinds of tips and strategies on how to get your kids excited about reading. And the more excited you get the kids reading, the more likely they are to read. And again, remember, the more they read, the better they get. Those are my gifts at freegiftfromdanny.com. And I just really appreciate all that you're doing, Dr. Heath, Sarah, all that you're doing. Keep on spreading the joy.
That's wonderful, and we're going to do one more thing on the show today before we let you go. We're going to go Freudian a little bit on Dr. Danny. I'm going to climb under into the deep, dark recesses of the therapy couch. See, right here I am. I'm going to look up something here. Okay, I'm going to pull out at random. All right, let's see what we got. All right here we go. Okay. Oh, it's upside down. Okay. Oh, my. Dr. Danny, as quickly as you can, what are three words that come to mind when I say the word cigar? And that doesn't get more Freudian than that. 3 words that come to mind when I say the word cigar.
So the 3 words for cigar, the first word is Cuba, and there's actually a great literacy story with that. In Cuba, at the companies, at the plants where they're rolling the cigars, they actually employ a person on a microphone to read aloud books to the workers as they're rolling the cigars. And so Cuba actually has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. So the first word would be Cuba for cigar. The second one would be lung, and the third one would be cancer.
Very nice.
I think that's a good fit. Hey, Danny, thank you so much for being with us. It has been a blast, and hope to have you back sometime. And keep up the wonderful work. You're changing lives every day. Thank you, TBALrs, for joining us. We look to catch you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Welcome to On the Couch and Off Our Rocker with Dr. Ima Freudnot, where we review our special guest TherapyBites Art Lab episode, Psychomolarchy Scale Assessment Results. That's PMS for short.
Dr. Danny Brassell's PMS performance places him in the 98th percentile on the PMS's BWS, Bookwormopathy scale. This indicates a prodigious propensity for ponderous manuscript perusal in Dr. Danny's cortical crevices, and a susceptibility to a redoubtable redundancy of readomosis. Overall, Dr. Danny Brassell's PMS psychosylmetric assessment results present a picture of an individual atrociously apt toward devoting his days to immense information ingestion, making him undoubtedly under the infectious influence of read-it-allitis, but who tames the inflammation to these implicit information imperative impulses via charitable contributions of extemporaneous allocution. This studiously sedulous soul likely has a prognosis of a most inauspicious ponderous diagnosis of cognition proliferation in the near future, until the dialectically deliberative features of his psyche have been psychomologically analyzed and exercised. It is my considered conclusion that Dr. Danny Brassell be prescribed a QAM dose of Read-O-Clovir and a QHS dose of anti-successional to regulate recurring bouts of acute perspicacious prosperititis. Dr. Ima Freudnot, Chief Shrinkstigator, TherapyBites Art Lab.
Grab some of this episode's guest merchandise, specially designed to help keep this episode's message top of mind in your life. Don't forget friends and family members who could use an Art Lab mental boost too. Just go to therapybites.myshopify.com.
Hey, TBALRs, thanks so much for being with us today. If we brought value to your day, show us some love by leaving your positive feedback and inviting some friends to listen in and join the T-Ball team. Next time on Therapy Bites Art Lab.
U.S. military veteran Charles Smith in the Art Lab today. T-Ballers, do we have a game plan for your life today? Are you hurting from past harms? Are you healing from past traumas? Are you waiting for those difficult emotions to subside? Today's guest has traveled that long recovery road. Charles is a lifelong survivor of multiple traumas, from being orphaned as a child to becoming a homeless veteran to surviving a suicide attempt. And he joins us today with not only inspiration, but proof that you can overcome the worst that life has to offer and use your pain as a building block in your own life and a stepping stone to lift others. Join us today for Uncaged, the Psychology of Self-Healing.
Government legal gobbledygook. Therapy Bites is not intended as a diagnostic or as an alternative to professional clinical treatment. Resources and advice are for information and entertainment purposes only. Brought to you by someone saying things you don't like? Tape that nagging loudmouth shut. Government-approved speech tape. Gas tape. Now available at your local hardware store. Therapy Bites Art Lab is not an approved, endorsed, authorized, butt-kissing affiliate of the United States Special Offense Assessment Police. SOAP for short. Warning. Consumption of Therapy Bites Art Lab content by Kool-Aid drinking, stinking, thinking, social media, pseudo-psychological pushing, wacky woke, anti-free speech, mumbo-jumbo advocates may cause spontaneous internal skull combustion, stomach discomfort, and or laxative effects. Allergy warning. Therapy Bites is manufactured in a facility that challenges nutty distortions, processes nuggets of accurate, realistic thinking, and life-affirming beliefs. This is the audio version of the legal fine print. Why are you still listening to this when you can catch the next great episode of Therapy Bites Art Lab with a good friend or family member? Really? Are you still there? This is getting silly. Move on to the next psychologically thrilling episode of the best advice on the net. No copay required.
Me eat copay.
Yeah, with Dr. Heath and the T-Ball team. Go ahead, don't be podgoraphobic. Scoot, scoot, scoot. On to the next episode.